I'm going to jump now from chapter 2 of Orthodoxy to chapter 4, not because nothing happened that was important in chapter 3. However, the goal of understanding Chesterton at this point is not to fully understand Orthodoxy, but to get the parts of his argument that are most relevant to the Inklings and the projects that they come up with after reading Chesterton's Orthodoxy. So chapter 4 is entitled The Ethics of Elfland. The ethics of Elfland become kind of a central idea for Lewis, Tolkien, Williams after Chesterton. The ethics of Elfland begin in a strange place. He doesn't actually begin with his argument about fairy tales, but he actually begins with an attack on liberalism and this idea that liberalism discounts democracy. To be truly free for Chesterton, you have to be free to include as many people as possible. And this would include all the people who have happened to have died, in his words. So a real democracy or real liberal democracy in which you have liberal or free discourse would be when you include those who have come before you. This means that tradition, the passing on of things, becomes central to his ideas. This will come up in Dorothy Sayers quite a bit as well. This understanding of tradition as being the passing on. We'll see this in Lewis, we'll see this in Tolkien, this idea that you take from the past and then you hold on to what is true and good and beautiful and you pass it on to the next generation. And so free discourse, liberal democracy begins here with this tradition idea. The democracy of the dead is the way that Chesterton talks about it. So what are these things from the past that continue to influence us that Chesterton wants to pass on to the next generation and not lose? For him, it's fairy tales. Fairyland for him is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. What you missed in chapter 3 was what he would call the suicide of thought. It's the attack on common sense by determinist, nihilist, materialist, who have forgotten that they are human beings with common sense and common realities that they can use their senses to describe. And so instead, he returns to the fairyland as the most common place for common sense. Now, this sounds paradoxical, and of course, this is always what Chesterton's doing, is he's playing with paradox. But for him, we have lost this understanding of fairyland really showing us the way that things are, that the imagination has access to understanding the world as it is, and it's not something that is disconnected from the world that we're living in. When you get to read Lewis's Surprised by Joy, he talks about how he used to consider fairy tales as leaving this world and then having to come back to this one. Instead, Chesterton and MacDonald are both talking about fairyland as an access to being able to see this world better. Wonder and welcome, as Chesterton has said in the introduction, wonder and welcome. The test of the imagination in fairyland is a test of who you are and your role in the cosmos. Every man has forgotten who he is, Chesterton writes. One may understand the cosmos, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star. We have all forgotten our names. We have all forgotten what we really are. You should hold on to this idea of a forgotten identity for the man who is Thursday. When we get to that book, he's going to play this idea out. We have all forgotten who we are. We are all disintegrated selves. And yet fairyland returns us to that sense of who we are, that we are called to be something in particular, and that we are created to be something in particular. In a sense, it shows us the role in the story. As I tell my students, most days now, everyone considers themselves the author of their own story, or they have a complex where they have to be the hero of their own story. In reality, most of us all have roles to play, but to consider ourselves the main character or the author of the story is not the role that we have been called to. We are characters within one another's stories. We are characters in a story that is being written by a divine author who also plays the hero of the story. He plays the rescuer. He plays the creator. He also plays the one who suffers and the one who dies. And we are then other characters in that world, but not ourselves defining that story or writing that story. Chesterton says, the test of all happiness is gratitude. When he's reading fairy stories, he feels grateful, but he's not a Christian, so he doesn't know what he's grateful for. He's happy, but who does he thank for such happiness? When you receive a gift, he says, you can thank the person who gives it to you, but who does one thank for the gift of birth, for the gift of life? He quotes Oscar Wilde, who says, we are not thankful for sunsets because we cannot pay for them. And Chesterton says it struck him that you could pay for them by not being Oscar Wilde, by not acting like Oscar Wilde. That in a sense, this gift you've received of birth, this gift of life, you could pay back by obedience, by living in a certain way that recognizes the gift giver and his design for you. And that was the secret that he discovered. And he discovered all of this before ever becoming a Christian, right? The other doctrine that he learns, so this doctrine of gratitude and happiness, but also the other doctrine he learns is conditional joy. He talks about how many men complain that you can't have more than one wife, and that all men are made to have several different women in their lives, and we're really not supposed to be monogamous beings. And Chesterton said that seems so silly to him. The logic of a fairy tale is you should be thankful that you ever saw a woman, let alone that you get to marry one, right? That the idea is a conditional joy, that you would enjoy the apple more by not eating too many of them, right? And we'll see, if you read Paralandra, you get to see this in Paralandra, that Ransom actually eats a piece of fruit from this Edenic world. And when he eats this piece of fruit, he wants more, and yet he realizes it would be the wrong thing to eat more of it. The fruit in itself was so satisfactory that it would be going beyond the bounds of that created thing to take more of it, to indulge in more of it. He would lose the savor or the flavor of that fruit in that experience. And this is the same kind of fairy tale logic that Chesterton's talking about. People complain, why did Cinderella, have to go home at midnight? Well, the fact that she got to go to the ball at all was the part of the story that most children recognize. It's only adult misuse of logic that makes it look the other way around. And so fairy tales return us kind of to this innocence, this childlike way of being and looking at the world that Chesterton wants to hold on to. He really believes that the fairy tale eyes, the eyes of the child in seeing things, would see things more accurately. And of course, we have biblical precedent for that as well, that Jesus said, do not keep the little children from coming to me, and unless you become like a little child, you will not see the kingdom of heaven. And Chesterton has that same idea that the ways that we see things as a child might be the way of seeing the kingdom of heaven. The conclusions of Elfland, he wraps it up at the end by saying, all this I felt. I think that's important because, as he told you, he's not going to go with deductions. And one of the things that we have to remember about the imagination, it's a creation of images, how we image ourselves, how we image the world, how we see things in the world, right? It's a way of seeing, a type of vision. This is not about mathematical principles. This is not about Euclidean geometry. This is actually just a way of envisioning the world as it is. And the way of seeing, then we respond to with a certain emotion or feeling. And this is different than a cognitive analysis, right? We don't feel certain things about 2 + 2 = 4. But we do feel certain things about the prince than marries the princess. And so Chesterton is talking about his way of understanding the world had much more to do with his feelings than the things he could add up and logically deduce about the world. So even though he's wrapping up conclusions, he's wrapping them up according to his imagination. He says, all this I felt, and here are the things that he felt. The world does not explain itself. It's fantastic. It makes me think of Mary Poppins, right? One thing you should know is that she never explains anything. 2, magic must have meaning, and if it means something, a meaning has someone to mean it. So now he's starting to become more of a convert to a personal understanding of the creator or the gift giver. Purpose is beautiful in its old design. The proper form of thanks is some form of humility and restraint. We should thank God for beer and burgundy by not drinking too much of them. And all good was a remnant to be stored and held sacred out of some primordial ruin. Here we go back to his Robinson Crusoe ideas, that we have saved these things as though from a wreck. So without ever becoming Christian, right, he is writing about his move towards faith. But before moving to that point where he accepted the doctrines of Christianity, he had some idea that the world does not explain itself, that its creator is beyond our ability to explain it. There is a gift giver that is giving meaning, that has designed things beautifully and with purpose, and yet there seems to have been some sort of wreck, and we are salvaging things from a wreck or from a ruin. All of this he got from reading fairy tales and trying to see the world through those eyes. I want to finish our discussion of orthodoxy by running quickly through the ideas that then motivate the Inklings. And what this means is I'm kind of just running through the text. You notice I'm hitting like 60 pages of text very quickly, highlighting the aphorisms, highlighting the ideas that come to play out in the Inklings' worldview. Chesterton writes, "We must be fond of this world to change it. We have to be fond of another world in order to have something to change it to." This is, again, this idea of the ethics of Elfland or of fairyland, that there is a higher imagination. If we can imagine another view of things, then it gives us something to reach towards. You can't have an ability to change the world unless you imagine there's an ought that is different from the is. This is the way things are, this is the way they ought to be, or that I imagine they ought to be, and therefore that imagination helps me figure out ways of making things change. And Chesterton said both visions are necessary. You can't just think of the is without the ideal, or else you're never going to change the is. The is perspective without any ought is going to become nihilistic, right? There's nothing else other than what we have. We have not any need to rebel against antiquity. We have to rebel against novelty. This will later become Lewis's idea of chronological snobbery. We don't rebel against what is old-fashioned. We rebel against what's newfangled. So for Chesterton, the better ideas seem to be those ideas that go on and on and on and on into the past, and we have to carry those forward into the future. The new ones don't really have any authority to them or any grounding to them, if they're too new or they're just for the sake of new seem good. Next, it is easy to be heavy, it is hard to be light. Satan fell by the force of his gravity. This becomes an idea that really defines the Inklings and defines all of them, including Dorothy Sayers, this idea of not taking things too seriously, right? So Chesterton was a man who spoke only in wit. When you read The Man Who Was Thursday, the character that most represents him is Gabriel Syme, and Gabriel Syme seems to make a joke out of everything. But not taking yourself too seriously means that you're not going to fall to the gravitas, right? If the entire Christian story ends up being a comedy or will be a comedy, then to take everything too seriously is not to entrust that comedy to its author, to assume that you have more control or more need for control in this world. It is a kind of gravitas that is actually sinful and proud. And all of the writers that we will see will talk about joy and merriment, right? Tolkien's taste of strawberries. It's just a beautiful line from the actual film, but also the same idea holds true in his novels. In Gaudy Night, Lord Peter Wimsey always seems to be taking everything lightly, taking everything for a joke, but that really is the secret to his success, the secret to being able to see through the mystery and see through the darkness and bring things to a comedic end or to a happy end. And we'll see this throughout our writers. We'll try to run through a few more of these. Hopefully you can take them and hold on to these as we read through our writers. Let's talk about the Christian story. Christian marriage is the great example of a real and irrevocable result. It is the chief subject and center of all romantic writing. You will get to see Christian marriage being understood in both That Hideous Strength and in Gaudy Night. What is Christian marriage to look like? For Chesterton, all Christian marriages were foolish, and that's why they are so beautiful and so good. We cannot reason them out and choose the best one. In some ways, they're always a leap of faith. To a Christian, existence is a story. This is the heart of the Inklings enterprise. A Christian thinks of existence as a story, In a thrilling novel, the hero is not eaten by cannibals, but it is essential that he might be eaten by cannibals, that there is the wreck in which we are saving things from the wreck or from the ruin, and that is the Christian story of existence. All Christianity concentrates on man at the crossroads. The true philosophy is concerned with an instant. Will a man take this road or that? And I notice, just paying attention to the language, many of these writers are all going to write with man at the center of things. By the time we get to Sayers, we'll see that she opens up that discourse somewhat. But a lot of these writers use man meaning human. Will we each take this road or that? And of course, the crossroads idea, the idea of the pilgrimage, of taking the road, of making the choice between two different ways of being, we're going to see this throughout. In A Gaudy Night, is it heart or is it brains? Or can it be both? In a paradoxical and Chestertonian way, can it be both? In Lord of the Rings, of course, always choosing the path that one takes and only knowing the path and not being able to control the end. In Lewis's That Hideous Strength, Mark's way towards Belbury or Jane's way towards St. Anne's. And so we have this constant sense of the Christian story being at a crossroads. This becomes a very Chestertonian idea here, but I think we see it elsewhere, that a good man may have his back to the wall is no more than we already knew, but that God could have his back to the wall is a boast for all insurgents forever. Christianity alone has felt that God, to be holy God, must have been a rebel as well as a king, and we'll see this in The Man Who Was Thursday. I'll read the last two quotes and then talk about them a little bit. Christianity preaches an obviously unattractive idea, original sin, but the results are pathos, brotherhood, or a fellowship, and a thunder of laughter and pity, for only with original sin we can at once pity the beggar and distrust the king. And finally, joy, the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. So this goes back to this idea of what we see in the Inklings' work is not the tragedy, it is not the dark writing of a lot of the modernist writers of the earliest 20th century. So you think of Virginia Woolf, who committed suicide, you think of D.H. Lawrence, Conrad, a lot of these troubled souls during the exact same time period, right? James Joyce, all of them are being dispelled of old authorities, old ideas, and feeling lost and in despair and suicidal. And in opposition to this, we see the Inklings. We see fellowship, we see friendship, joy, beauty, the taste of the good, the uplifting of the small. And they all have that in common, that they will talk with great delight about their meals, about their drinks, about the daily things of their life that make life worth living. And a lot of these ideas of the commonplace being regarded so highly, the enchanted way of viewing the world, comes from Chesterton himself.